see all of your names in the chat. There's so many of you that I've known and worked with, so welcome, welcome to the Virtual Sailor eResources Symposium. I'm Liz Sunderman-Zinger. I'm the Chief of the Central Library of the Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore and the State Library Resource Center. I'm really excited to welcome those of you coming from all different libraries, public, academic, K-12, and Sam from Lyrasis. This past year, we've been changing up, or as I like to think about it, leveling up all of our conferences, and this one's no exception. I think you'll be really pleased with the content today. In addition to learning about why and how to use the Sailor resources we provide, you'll also have the opportunity to hear from the excellent Dr. Turner Lee and presenters from Pratt and Slurk, as well as folks from around the state to engage you with additional electronic resources, how to use those resources, how to maintain them, and resources really tailored to your specific user groups. So I'd also like to take a moment to thank Jody Hoover, who's the manager of the digital resources here at Pratt and Slurk, for all of the work she's done to bring this together. And I just wanted to point out that she has a whole team that works for her every day and for all of you every day to make Digital Maryland, the State Documents Depository, the Sailor databases, ebooks, and other digital resources available to everyone in Maryland. So just a shout out to her team. They include Khaditra Harvey, Danielle Ford, Francis Protahall, James McLaughlin, Megan Keene, Sarah Cooperman, Sheila Ricks, and Wilmer Cady. And also, of course, thanks to Paula Mitchell, JP Paris-Santana, Megan Hebern, John Jewett, and everyone else who worked to make this conference technically possible. So please know that this is a whole department, and we're all here to support you in your pursuit of using the digital resources every day. So with that, let's get on with the symposium. I'm going to turn it back over to Deputy Chief Michael Johnson. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Liz. And as I was noted, I forgot to introduce myself, but thank you, Liz. My name is Michael Johnson. I'm one of the deputy chiefs here at Pratt Library, State Library Resource Center. Liz, thank you for the welcome, and we're super happy to have everybody here today. And I do want to thank, second all the thanks to Jody, Sarah, Paula, and all the AV support team, who even this morning were working through lots of stuff to make sure we can get ready for today. We are super excited to have Dr. Nicol Turner Lee with us today as our keynote speaker. Before we get into the introduction, though, I did want to, we talked a little bit about the Zoom logistics, but wanted to cover a few of those. We are using, you're welcome to use chat on the side throughout to talk amongst yourselves and share things. For questions for Dr. Turner Lee, though, please use the Q&A at the bottom. We're going to be capturing those, so at the end of her keynote, we'll be able to do a Q&A with her and keep track of all those questions. And you can find that should be down, even though the participants aren't down there. The Q&A hopefully is down there, so you can spot that. And just wanted to let you know that today's session will be recorded and will be available at the end of the conference as well. And so we are super excited to have Dr. Turner Lee come speak to us this morning. Her enthusiasm and knowledge really, I think, has already gotten us really excited just in our talks as we prep for this symposium. I think we got a really interesting discussion and presentation for us today, for you all today. So Dr. Nicol Turner Lee is a senior fellow in governance studies, the director of the Center for Technology Innovation, and serves as co-editor-in-chief of TechTank. Dr. Turner Lee researches public policy designed to enable equitable access to technology across the U.S. And to harness its power to create change in communities across the world. Her work also explores global and domestic broadband deployment and internet governance issues. She's an expert on the intersection of race, wealth, and technology within the context of civic engagement, criminal justice, and economic development. Her current research portfolio also includes artificial intelligence, particularly machine learning algorithms, and their unintended consequences on marginalized communities. Her recent co-authored paper on the subject has made her a sought-after speaker in the U.S. and around the world on the topics of digital futures, AI and ethics, algorithmic bias, and the intersection between technology and civil and human rights. She's also an expert on topics that include online privacy, high-speed broadband, 5G networks, as well as the digital divide. Dr. Turner Lee has a forthcoming book on the U.S. digital divide titled Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass, forthcoming in 2024 from Brookings Press. She also sits on various U.S. federal agency and civil society boards, including those chartered by the Federal Communications Commission, the National Academies, and New York State's Division of Financial Regulation. Dr. Turner Lee has a PhD and MA from Northwestern University and graduated from Colgate University. And with that, Dr. Turner Lee, thank you so much for coming, and we are really excited to hear you speak. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. Thank you to Liz. Thank you to Sarah, who had me speak to you the first time in person, if you all recall. And I want to also thank Jody for being the glue that pulled all this digital stuff together with JP, who is behind the scenes as well. Listen, I'm excited to be back. And I think I'm excited for a couple of reasons. One, because I had the privilege of speaking to all of you before the pandemic hit in person, if you all recall. And I was really excited then because I was at the beginning of my book project, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But I'm also excited because I think we have this opportunity to renorm and reimagine what libraries look like in the 21st century. So please, please accept this honor and privilege, and accept this honor and privilege from the standpoint that I'm standing on a Zoom right now trying to make this work. So that speaks a lot to what Liz and Michael have been trying to do with the organization and move you forward in terms of the resources available. With that, a lot has happened since we last spoke, as I've mentioned. The global pandemic turned out to be a time of trauma, of pain, of sadness, of reunification. You know, as President Joe Biden said yesterday in the State of the Union, which touched me in particular, that there are a lot of people who are not sitting around the dinner table as a result of the 1 million+ deaths that happened here in the United States and the more deaths that actually occurred across the globe. And so it's no secret that we have been in a state of recovery and recuperation in this country, one that came from an unforeseen and unpredictable and at some point unmanageable virus. And friends, that is important because I want to acknowledge all of you, because you stood in the gaps when that uncertainty actually emerged, and you continue to do so at your local branches, whether you're in a school, whether you're in a community, whether you stand in a rural community or urban. Let me just share with all of you that I see you and I understand, because I too went through this very similar experiences personally and professionally. And we're at a time where those limitations that occurred during the pandemic were real. And so I want to acknowledge that, because I don't often think that we get to say things like thank you and to show our humility for some of us who have gone through some personal and professional challenges. And friends, if there's another major lesson that COVID taught us, which I think is pertinent to share, is that the normalcy that we had prior to that pandemic will never be the same. What is normal? There's not normalcy that we're actually going to see, because the future and innovation really held tight to hold our hand as we physically distance. And it's led to things like this, where we can be all over the state and still come into one location. We didn't have this before the pandemic, or we at least knew it was available, right? But we didn't readily use it. And now we're in a world, because of a deadly and traumatic experience, that there might be glimpses of hope. And so I want to share that, because part of what I want to do in the time that I have with you is to think through, where do you sit in this larger ecosystem of change? And how do you continue to mitigate and navigate through challenges and make those challenges into successes and opportunities in the state of Maryland and our nation's library system? You know, I told this story and I'm gonna tell it again, because I wouldn't be a PhD if it wasn't for all of you, about when I was a kid living in New York, in Westchester County, New Rochelle to be exact. We had one big library because we had one high school that served 3,000 students. And then we had one library downtown near the roller skating rink at that. So you could tell my age, right? And every day after school, we would actually walk to the library and we would take out a bundle of books. And that librarian, at first, she would raise her eyebrow and look at us and thinking that we were going to cause trouble or talk loud. But really, she was excited by our presence because that meant that the intellectual curiosity that we had from elementary to high school was going to mean something. You know, in my high school, we had a great rate of college graduation at the time. In the 1980s, we were looking at about 90%. But we went to those locations and we bonded with the people who worked in those institutions because times were different. The internet in general has actually done a lot to make things that Robert Putnam in Bowling Alone talked about, this individualized experiences that we have in collective and immersive environments. They don't involve us going into brick and mortar as much as we used to. And they often don't involve the trust and the confidence that we had in our communities and our institutions. So I wanted to put that out there because I'm gonna talk a little bit about that in this new 21st century environment. But I'm always humbled to share that I wouldn't be where I'm sitting today if it wasn't for a librarian. She took me down those aisles and showed me a lot of books. And to this day, I still go into the local library to work on my research for my book. And I also used my local library back in the days when I was writing my 500-page dissertation. You matter. And I share that because despite what we're seeing in terms of disruption and economic uncertainties, libraries still maintain the presence that they had when I was growing up. I don't think across the country, and I'll share some stats shortly, that libraries changed their character during the pandemic. In fact, you did more. And there were great cases throughout the state of Maryland, throughout the world and the country, that we were able to see libraries go the extra mile that they were already doing to ensure that people were connected in ways that they needed to vaccination scheduling, to trying to keep up with their homework, to find housing when housing insecurity was in front of their face, to ensure that they enrolled for public benefits and public programs. You know, no one probably has sat there and talked about you all like this in a long time. So please pardon me if I get emotional and I get entrenched, because I do believe that unless we acknowledge our local champions, that the conversations that we have going forward will be for naught. You matter. And I think in the end, as we have this conversation as part of my keynote, I want to leave you with 3 areas that will matter the most as we reimagine and re-envision the way that you do your work. Listen, I entitled my book, Digitally Invisible, How the Internet is Creating the Underclass. I know, I'm sorry, I did a shameless plug. It's coming out in January of 2024. Hopefully you all will have me back and I can talk about it again. But I used the title of Digitally Invisible. It was funny, I had to call up Mr. Biden because President was using the word invisible a lot last night if you watch the State of the Union. But I used it because I believe, as I read in a book in graduate school by Michael Harrington, The Other America, that we often forget about the people who live in our rural communities. And we forget about the young people that go to our urban schools. Digitally invisible is not necessarily only about the socioeconomic barriers that they face, the barriers of poverty, of race, of ethnicity, and language and age. It's also about the people who live in, and I think when I met with you the first time, those folks that lived in Garrett County, Maryland, the farmers that cannot get access to technology, who actually sit in their homes and watch it a mile away, but are not able to use it to determine whether or not they should water their lands or scour the manures, because the technology does not enable new innovation or precision agriculture. Guess what? They're part of that invisible class. Their inability to do things. I was out in Garrett County and I remember talking to someone who said, you know, dear, we don't have Uber, because not necessarily because people don't have a lot of working cars, but we also don't have it because we don't have consistent and reliable internet. Invisibility is a large portion of the conversation we're going to have this morning. How do you, as librarians and leaders in libraries, work to unravel the invisibility that we not only have placed on historically disadvantaged populations, but now that we're putting on people whose extra stresses based on where they live, what they earn, what their education is, the intersectionality of all those things also make them invisible. Friends, We know that the pandemic surfaced just how invisible people are in this country. We didn't realize how many young people had to go to the stoops of libraries and McDonald's to get online to do schoolwork. We also didn't know about the educators who sat around the corner from them, nearby the library, tapping into your internet so they could teach their lesson. We didn't know that we were going to need those libraries open to help us with the provision of services. We didn't know. And I think it's okay for us to say that we didn't know. But what we did know, particularly as we think about 21st century environments, that there were already 14 million people that were not connected to any type of online resource. And we also knew that many of those people could not necessarily afford it or were not in close proximity to competitive services. We also knew that the people who experienced the most insecurities in this country, the homeless, sat in the kiosk in your libraries to apply for housing and to search for other applications that could improve their quality of life. So when the doors closed on our schools and our libraries, it changed our lives. There will never be normal, not the way we know it. You know, I used to say when I was growing up that, you know, being normal meant getting up and going to school. All those kids that tried to do all that creative stuff and play guitar and be in bands, that wasn't normal. Well, guess what? I got a college student who's at UVA who plays guitar. He's normal, according to his friends. When we think about the circumstances that impacted where we are today, I share that not to wake you up and have your cup of coffee sitting in front of you not being enough to consume because I'm just way too much this morning. But I share that because life has changed and so must we. Life has changed and so must we. And so what does that mean? Can I push it? When it comes to libraries, how do we reimagine what a 21st century library looks like, particularly within the context of a digital environment that not only impresses accessibility to computers, but even more extended value when we talk about digital literacy? Do you know that what we're actually going to see in the next few years is the plethora of new jobs in high-speed broadband, fiber installation, and other fiber optics jobs and other things like that? Cloud computing and customer service. But guess what? We need libraries to help in the training of the workforce of the future. That goes beyond the general, how do you turn on a computer and how you set up an email address. Come on, shame the devil if your library is still teaching those basic functions. We need to push ourselves so that our libraries become part of the solution towards greater competitiveness of the people that we care about most, which are those people that you know sit in your libraries for 7 to 8 hours a day, killing the time because it's a safe space for engagement. Friends, just like when I ran to the library after school and I sat there with that librarian who opened up my eyes to all of the discovery that I was constrained by. Because back then, if you recall, there weren't a lot of Black women writers that we read in the classroom. I discovered Nikki Giovanni and Toni Morrison and all those people at my local library. But now, these new dictates of our new economy have taken that intellectual curiosity and combined it with the need for survival so that people who are in our communities just don't survive, but they need to thrive through your resources. You know, I'm taking to a visit that I made to Phoenix, Arizona before the pandemic. I was working on book research and I had just left an elementary school and I drove to the local library in hopes of interviewing people who were randomly visiting and hearing their experiences with broadband within the home and community. And I remember watching a woman who was getting a library card renewed and she walked out into the parking lot. And I was done at the time, you know, just looking around and talking to people. And I sort of saw her sitting on a stoop. And I went up to this woman, her name was Frances, by the way. And I asked her what she was doing at the local library. Well, as you all know, and you've seen this before, she was waiting for her son who was actually in there doing his homework. And she was just killing time because they didn't have a computer or internet at the home. But then Frances went on to tell me that while she was in there, she unfortunately had to go online to look at some health records. her doctor had just informed her of a stage 4 cancer diagnosis. And if it had not been for the internet, it would not have been discovered for her because she had spent her last dollar on the train and the bus to get to the local facility downtown Phoenix. To me, that touched me because most of us don't do private transactions like that in the local library, but Frances did. And you were welcoming space for her to find that out and be on a road to recovery. Friends, you matter, you matter, you matter. And so I think it's important that we think about your role in this 21st century beyond the books and the walls that exist, beyond the rows of computers that align the public spaces of our libraries, beyond the study rooms that are only available, by going up to that desk and reserving it. Listen, you are part of the institutional and community fabric that matters to the future well-being of this country and to the state of Maryland. And without that assumption and that leading value, our conversations on how we're going to continue to resource and staff our library systems may be in naught. So allow me to move beyond the trauma of the pandemic and to really begin to focus on the opportunities and the possibilities. And in addition to saluting you, I want to put you to work because I think it's important that all of you that are watching me understand that your work is not done. And your work is not only not done, but it's going to change. But before you start getting mad that this woman is coming to your space telling you to do more work, I want to be clear that the work that I'm suggesting is not one of more busy work, but it's one that contextualizes your experiences for the betterment of the people you serve and for this state of Maryland. So let me talk a little bit about why that matters nationally. And then I'm going to do just like a Black Baptist preacher. And I'm going to give you 4 points and let you go on your way. I promise I won't pass a collection plate, but I'm going to make sure you leave with 4 points that impress, hopefully, more conversation. So put those questions in the chat. And if you like what you hear or you don't, put it in the chat. Let's have a conversation. First and foremost, let me share some statistics that have pertinent to libraries over the course of the pandemic to today. First and foremost, in the 21st century, circulation of adult and children's physical books increased from 4.5% to 8% during the pandemic. So people were reading over the course of the pandemic, which I think is really important. But what we experienced in March 2022 was that 99% of public libraries closed. Just like our schools, just like our businesses, the majority of libraries closed, and in the state of Maryland, those numbers were pretty consistent. The ongoing pandemic also exacerbated some of the challenges because you got to remember, you all were ahead of the curve when it came to digitization. Libraries were already digitizing collections. They were already coming up with renewal processes that could be done online or check in and check out. Libraries, particularly 78% of them, extended their renewal policies in March 2020. You didn't chase down those books because there was nobody there to collect them and store them and put them back, I'm sure. 62% of libraries added virtual programming beginning in the pandemic, but 45% were forced to reduce or eliminate programs because of financial constraints. So more book readership, more extension and agility in your renewal policies, more virtual programming, but all of that juxtaposed against cuts, budget cuts and staff cuts. And that actually impacted libraries because compared to what we're seeing with schools, many libraries had to reduce across the country staff by 29%. Programs and services were the biggest challenges for libraries. And it's not to say that all of you were equally impacted. There were some libraries across the country, and here in the state of Maryland, I'm sure, that actually deployed bookmobiles or leveraged local library posts within communities. But we did see a very difficult situation of trying to provision the same type of analog services to patrons. 71% of librarians were allowed to work remotely, but that was only true of about 62% of rural library professionals. So for those of you in rural libraries, you know that you had even a greater challenge because not only were you closed, but in many cases, you were the town hall. In addition to the fire station and the police station and the main rural town, main building in the town, you were the hub. And so many rural librarians were not able to actually stay at home. And it was even harder because you didn't have broadband, right? If I'm preaching to the choir, say amen. If I'm talking down the side of my neck, say ouch. 79% of libraries anticipated their patrons needing the internet. And even more anticipated materials in physical nature were also needed. So we had about 79% of libraries who realized that this pandemic has basically upended the need of my patrons to get online to do these things I just talked about. What Francis was doing, what a person who was housing insecure was doing, what a student was doing. But we also knew for those young people who were doing research assignments that they needed books. Libraries did benefit from resources at the time of the pandemic, particularly in Maryland. There was a huge, huge investment by Governor Hogan, and now hopefully by the new governor, to invest resources in libraries. And the American Library Association, that some of you already may be aware of, gave its own COVID library relief fund, which we don't talk about enough, which allocated about $1.25 million to libraries experiencing COVID-related challenges. A lot of libraries who were on the brink of closing actually benefited from many of those $40,000 grants to maintain some level of operation or to keep staff salaries paid. In addition to that, some of the pandemic relief monies generally was allocated by states, like in Maryland, to our schools and libraries to ensure some type of continuity outside of those closures. And fast forward to November of 2021, we've actually seen the beginning conversation, and now in the last year, the codification of the American Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA, which provides $65 billion towards high-speed broadband networks across the country, with a particular focus on states and localities to organize people like yourself as they allocate monies in what are called digital equity grants of about about $2 billion that will promote digital access and digital literacy. Libraries are eligible to apply as long as they are connected to their state representatives, who right now have pretty much received about $175 million to do some planning around what they want to do with a larger grant, which will be in the billions. Now, you may say to me, Dr. Turner Lee, I'm a policymaker. I'm just a librarian that works in Talbot County. Why are you telling me this? Well, I'm telling you this for a couple of reasons. If you don't know, now you know. The monies that you have been looking for have been made available. So not only did we have the stresses of the pandemic on our library staff and our institutions, we also saw a plethora of funding during the pandemic to fill in those gaps. But what I'm going to share when I start to close is that libraries need to be at the table in the discussion of any new monies that comes through states so that you are not facing the same challenges over and over and over again. I'm sharing that for a couple of reasons before I go into my 4 points, because we need you to be resourced, not so that you can continue to help the everyday Joe and Jane that come through your facilities, not so that you can impress upon, like you did for this young Black woman right here, all of the knowledge and insight that I needed, but we need you at the table because you best understand the community. And we similarly need libraries because we are in a state right now, friends, where our democracy is threatened, where people are making decisions that are based on online assumptions and not within the crevices of those books that we can touch and feel, or those validated resources. I'm getting so excited, I'm almost losing my breath. Let me grab my water. First and foremost, let me talk to you about what I mean by that. Our digital democracy is at stake. If libraries do not have the success that we need them to have, we run the risk of going deeper and deeper in this digital desolation that we've created. Let me talk about what I mean by that. First, the pandemic revealed the unevenness and proximity of resources to everyday people. And that threat to democracy, and what the internet has done on the perilous side is it's created what we call misinformation and disinformation that is often not supported by the resources that all of you actually know. I take my kids oftentimes to the library, and sometimes we find ourselves in Barnes and Noble. And I find myself as a person with a PhD ashamed that my kids would actually be excited at a Barnes and Noble, because it always lands up with a purchase versus when we go into a library and it's free. I think we need to understand the reason why this conversation and these resources are important, that our libraries are public assets and public goods to our society. And so when we don't fund them in the ways that you can perform, not just the things that you did before, remember, what was normal then is no longer the same. But we need libraries to have access to the resources that we know people are now learning and earning by, whether it's artificial intelligence and virtual reality systems, whether it's training that provides people industry certification. Libraries have to be resourced to play that role. And most importantly, to fight misinformation, we need our young people to come into our libraries and read counter stories and other opinions so that they're not taken by what they just read online. We need libraries to be part of the rebuilding of our democratic character and to bring that confidence back. And I was on a podcast not too long ago where I said to some folks, without the investment in libraries and new alternative media, we run the risk of not teaching the type of civil and civic tools that our young people need to make determinations on what are truthful and false information. We've got to really hone in on this, my friends. And what I like about this conference is that this allows you this opportunity to do a couple of things. One, to convene, but most importantly, to reflect and to collaborate on what's next. So I'm going to go into 3 points that I think are really important, or 4, as I said. And I promise to stay brief because I want your questions. Let's get that chat rolling. Let's get these questions rolling. First and foremost, I think it's important that we acknowledge everything that I said about the pandemic and move on. That may be controversial to some. It's often controversial to me when I say it, because how can you move on from something that is still here? But we need to acknowledge the pandemic's challenges and move on from there so we can actually begin to recalibrate and reimagine who we are. Let me talk about what I mean by moving on. In no way am I suggesting that we eliminate or obliterate the realities of that 99% of public libraries that were closed in March 2020. But I think it's important that we understand the continuing significance of our institutions to the communities in which we serve. The people most affected by the pandemic were the digitally invisible, but they were also older Americans, farmers, Amish communities like those I met in Garrett County, who wanted to leverage and utilize those resources for small business support, for, again, government and public benefits. We need to recognize that we're back in business, per se, and it's time for us to come in with even stronger capacity and stronger will to get this right. Winston Churchill has said, and I paraphrase, that failure is not in the sense failure. It's an indicator of future success. Let me ask all of you, what are you doing in your courageousness to take what you've learned over these last 2 years and come back bigger and better so that your institution is even more embracing and understanding of the challenges of the people around you? What are you forcing yourself to actually look at when you walk into your offices, when you look at the people who are still there and the new ones have joined you on these 8-hour days where they're trying to find and navigate through these resources? What are you asking yourself about the pandemic itself? Are you still angry and mad and traumatized? I mean, I know I was for a long time. I could not understand what happened. But how are you channeling that so that you can actually create a greater and bigger purpose for the libraries that are in the state of Maryland and for the library community at large? We have to acknowledge that we all went through it. And so now it's time for us to collaborate as a community and to reflect and recalibrate and come back bigger and stronger. Winston Churchill, success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It's the courage to continue that counts. Where's your courage, my friends? Where's your courage? You know, over the course of the pandemic, I spoke to so many librarians who were just, the oxygen was just taken out of their body. They were exhausted. They were hurt that they couldn't see the people that they regularly saw and served. They felt humiliated that the country didn't realize the value of their stoops over McDonald's. Where is your courage to make the statement that you're coming back bigger and stronger? And how do we take communities and states like in the ones in Maryland and work together for greater purpose? You know, there were a lot of people in communities of color that were greatly affected by the pandemic. And a lot of people who died because of the disproportionate rate of folks that died were older, and they were also very poor, and they were also of color. And the reason was not so much that they caught COVID, you know, because it was widespread in their communities or in their households. They caught COVID because they lived in housing that had 4 or 5 generations of families. They caught COVID because they delivered the food to our doorsteps, and they were the ones that were our home healthcare aides. They caught COVID because prior they lived in communities with high pollution and congestion. They were poor with adequate and minimal or non-existent access to healthcare or medical institutions. They caught COVID because they sat in a scenario in which the lack of care that was attributed and given to them made them more vulnerable and susceptible to disease, and they passed it on. Libraries caught COVID when 99% of you all closed. But you got to come back stronger, because at the same time, the library, and I constantly say this, and sometimes people look at me, I say it in Congress, I say it wherever, it was the library's stoop that mattered. It was the school stoop that mattered. It was the church stoop that mattered. And yet we still don't give the type of congratulatory support and resources to those institutions. So that's why I say, we recognize that we've gone through this 2 years, and now it's time to reimagine the 21st century library in the state of Maryland and come back stronger and more courageous. My second point is, once we've gotten past this, then maybe we can begin to embrace what I call the reset clock on professional development for librarians, and pay particular attention to what worked with regards to blended technology, so that we can continue that rather than returning back to the way we used to do stuff, that normal, that is no longer normal, right? What does that mean? We saw that in schools, and many of you who are school librarians that are in K through 12, when the school closed, schools immediately had to transition across the country 50 million children in K through 12 to online platforms. And what we found in the beginning is they weren't quite successful, right? Because they found out that a digital divide was wider within school systems than ever thought of before. And more importantly, young people didn't have home broadband, so they weren't able to do work at home. And then there were multiple households where the oldest child had to teach the youngest child. About 35% of the kids that were actually in public schools were in poverty. And as a result, in rural and urban areas, there was no shepherd of those resources for those young people. Teachers had to learn quickly how to get online and do distance learning. And if you notice, and this is, I know I'm speaking to my K through 12 school librarians, that now everybody is back, but there's still this propensity to still want to go online and do certain things. Because guess what? It worked. Research has suggested that when technology is used as an enabler and not just a platform, that we get closer to the people that we're serving. And that works for a variety of reasons. It helps us to customize and tailor solutions. Imagine during the pandemic, many of you realized that the people who had less ability, the disabled, who were coming into the library weren't able to, but they probably were on most of your online classes. And when the switch to virtual programming happened, it probably opened up a can of worms for them to be able to actively engage the institution. There's been this myth in this country that getting back to the way things were is returning to just in person. And I'm probably among many of you, you've struggled on ways to balance hybrid with in-person based on your funding structures, your budget limitations, and your staff competencies. What I'm suggesting in the second point, it's time to reset the clock on professional development for librarians. How do we get our librarians, particularly those of you that have been here for 20 to 30 years, to begin to think differently on how we engage technology as an enabler and not just a platform? How we look beyond software applications that are just loaded on our computers, and we think less transactionally and more holistically on how we integrate this into our everyday lives. Like I said, libraries have been doing this for a very long time. I was around when Google first came around to digitize or buy the library collections and work with libraries to digitize many of those collections. I mean, nowadays, you can go into a library or you can go online for microfiche collections through your local library systems. My point is, we're at a state where we need to equally think about the professional development of our librarians in the state of Maryland and how they're being exposed to these multiple media and methodologies that will allow us to maintain the same type of energy, personalization, excitement among people who cannot regularly get to the library, so we can make it work. You know, in Marion, Alabama, where I visited for my book, they had a library that was a great resource for the pandemic because the librarians used to come to the school and work with the K-12 librarians that were stationed at the school. But in rural communities, as many of you know, the library ain't close. And I put that quite simply because the library is often about 4 or 5 miles away from the school. And if you live in a rural area, there tends to be less transportation options for young people to get to you. So the principal was telling me in Marion, Alabama, that the closest library was about 4 or 5 miles away. By the time I got there, it was closed. But it rang for me a point, particularly when the pandemic hit a year later, that we need to find ways to either import libraries back into our communities or find ways to have these models during the pandemic. We learned about them where young people can engage the library from school, internet services, and hopefully, if we can get this right for our country, from their privacy of their own home. How many of you on this call have gone through a professional development training that's having you think differently about hybrid engagement and blended engagement in our library systems? We will not be responsive 21st century institutions if we just err on the side of and I'm going to put it bluntly because I'm that age, of only making a phone call if you have a quarter in your pocket. Those days, my friends, are being revolutionized. And if you missed that because you're younger than 40 and 50, back in the days, you couldn't make a phone call unless you went to a payphone and deposited a quarter. You had to have change. And nowadays, many of us don't keep any change. I take all the change out of the bottom of my purse and put it in the candy jar simply because it weighs down my ability when I'm walking around town. Friends, librarians, and administrators need that professional development because it's time to reset the clock. If the pandemic taught us anything outside of all of the other challenges that we had, is that we can do things differently and we can reach more people. What is your digital outreach plan? Not the stuff that you do within the doors of the library, not the regular updates on the computers, not necessarily whether or not the printer is calibrated to be online with the computers, not always the type of Wi-Fi infrastructure that we have in the building. What are we doing to transport and make our services readily available outside of the building? And how are librarians who have come out of analog tradition working to have the courageousness and the competency to change how we operate? Friends, that is a 21st century library. Back in the days when I was talking about my library experiences, the bookmobile was the innovation of that day. Having the bookmobile come into our communities and us running up on that van and grabbing a few books. Then later, the library trees in local communities became the next innovation. Listen, the pandemic taught us as we move beyond the trauma, but it's taught us that we can do these things. But we need training. We need training that helps us to position it, fund it, support it, and bring others along. My third point, after we acknowledge that the pandemic happened and we move on, after we invest in the professional development of librarians and those in this ecosystem to be supportive of what a 21st century vision for our library systems look like, particularly in the state of Maryland, let me go to the third point. We need to take the temperature of the patrons in our highly online social world. What do I mean by that? Well, I'll be blunt. We need to take back our kids. We need to figure out ways to balance social media so that they understand that learning is social and engagement is social. But again, going back to my comment about misinformation, we need our young people to leverage our library institutions to be skilled and knowledgeable about how our world works. You know, over the last few years, I struggle as a parent because much of what my kids talk about are on TikTok and other social media platforms. Some of them I don't even know about. And when they come to me and they ask me about what my opinions are, I struggle because I go back and talk to them about books that I've read, and I refer them to other resources. We've sort of juxtaposed these two realities between the parent and the kid as being different realities. I've actually learned how to use the internet over the years for my own self-discovery, particularly when I can't make it into a library. And libraries have adapted to that change, as I've already mentioned. Like I said, when I was working on high school research papers I was trying to share with my kids, I had to go in and go to the microfiche machine and sit there for hours trying to read the small print of old newspapers. Now, because of digitization, many of that stuff is available online. But we still fail to acknowledge that our young people and our adult learners live in a very social world. And I bring that up because we often don't take that temperature to figure out how our public institutions even adapt to some of that social engagement to get more people excited about the things that we do. I once saw on the internet a teacher who was trying to get more of his kids into online learning. And what he did was he did a TikTok, and there's various reasons why TikTok may or may not be the right medium. But he basically did a TikTok every day about the lesson plan that increased the engagement of students in the classroom. This was in an urban school. And it's really cute because he's like, okay, today we're talking about weather. And he comes outside and he's doing all this stuff. Friends, how many of you, one, even understand this stuff, know about this stuff, but are figuring out ways to engage libraries within a highly social ecosystem? To what extent are you playing against the fears of social media, playing it against the typical violence and other things that are not so great that show up on these platforms? And to what extent are libraries even becoming the core to share with folks how to effectively use these things, how to protect their privacy, how to be engaged in these environments in a more healthy, civil way? You know, I struggle in my work as a policymaker because I sit in Washington, D.C., near you all, with folks that don't understand the lived experiences of communities. That's why I'm saying to you, if you don't want to get into policy, at least know who's making decisions in your state when it comes to broadband access. Engage in collaborations or cooperate with other entities that are nationally, like the Shelby, the Schools and Libraries Association, who are trying to make sure that libraries get their lion's share of this new $64 billion. We need you Because as things like social media and other highly social technological tools become more prominent, they fight against and they butt against the traditional systems of learning that we need to make sure that people still have access to. Whether you have an internet or connection or not, you still have a local library. Whether you're online through your phone or not, you still have a local library. Friends, it is so important that we craft the rules of community technology in our institutions. But we do that with our patrons. We find out from them, what do they want to see? We figure out ways to meet them where they're at. Like I said, either through blended or hybrid programming, or whether understanding where they sit in a highly social world. You know, I always, again, remember growing up as a young kid, sitting in the library in that reading corner where the librarian would do these extra special challenges and actually engage the kids to do things like, 30 minutes, find the top 5 books on this topic, or go find a book and write a paragraph. I write about in my book how back in the days, my family had collections of the Encyclopedia Britannica before I went to the Microsoft Encarta CD. Listen, we can take the temperature. We don't have to be on this stuff, but we have to understand a lot of what this highly social world means and what those threats are to our public goods, like I said, our public assets that are, again, playing a huge role in the normalization of democracy in our society. And last, and certainly not least, because I want to see these questions coming in a moment, I'm going to open it up and we're going to have a talk about everything that I spoke about. Let's lead with diversity and equity top of mind. And let's make our library systems, urban and rural, the main catalyst for creating an environment and culture where we will not leave any child or any adult that wants to visit our institutions behind. Years ago, I used to do some work with the Urban Libraries Council. This is back in the early 2000s when they were actually forming this association in Chicago and find ways to bring more resources to urban libraries, particularly in big metropolitan areas. And over time, as I've gotten to meet all of you and other library professionals, you realize that the challenges may be geographically different from rural and urban, but there's an overarching theme when it comes to our nation's libraries, which is you are the equalizer for many citizens and populations across this United States of America. And I think it's important that we lead with equity in mind. Yes, we're continuously becoming better stewards of these concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But what does equity mean in a community? Again, when a young person doesn't have home broadband, or a young lady like Frances doesn't have access to a computer to go look at her doctor's notes. What does having a library in a community not just mean to being able to level the playing field for learners, but also engaging people with resources and training that allow them to have at least a step up in our society? It's a research report I recently read that most ex-offenders go to their local libraries, giving them that other second chance to understand better what's happening in our local society, in our local communities and society. Equity must be top of mind, and it must be a continuous challenge for all of you. You matter to that young person who sits in the library either to read a book or to not be cold at home, because when they sit in your library, they feel, again, the safe space and the comfort. You matter when it comes to equity, because you're able to objectively define the stories, or at least provide a range of opinions for students who are battled and challenged by a lot of the discourse that happens publicly that they are exposed to, because we as adults are still fighting it out over whether or not this should be included in curricula or not. You matter in terms of equity, because you are able to level the playing field when it comes to resources. I cannot tell you how proud I am that I got the call to come back and speak to all of you. And honestly, I want to stop talking because I want to hear from you. Libraries are a significant aspect of the social structure of our society. And those of you in the state of Maryland, you are playing a role in your specific communities, whether people tell you that or not. And equity, though frustrating at times to lead with equity and lead with programming and lead with the type of added responsibilities that all of you have, without a focus on equity or prioritization of equity between our urban and rural libraries and the context and circumstances that affect both differently. Challenges in urban libraries are different from those that happen internally in rural. At the end of the day, we constantly have to keep equity in mind. You know, when I was in Hartford, Connecticut, and I tell these stories, again, my book is coming out in January 2024, please have me back. But I remember a young person I met who would go to the local library from their school to do the homework. And she shared how she had to cross several lines of, gang communities and others just to get to the local library, but it was all worth it in the end. One, because it provided a quiet space for her to work. And then two, because she didn't have a computer and she didn't have the internet. She didn't have the encyclopedia. She didn't have the resources that I bet you if I scanned the room that I'm in, you would see a big bookcase full of books, because that's, again, an indicator, and reading has always been an indicator that we can break the trajectory of poverty by exposing people to the ability to read and to compute. But my point is, for that young lady that I interviewed in Hartford, Connecticut in 2020, the library was her refuge. You play a role in ensuring that equity is top of mind in your communities and in your institutions. And that's not the equity that we're used to dealing with as to who gets the computer first and how long. It's the equity that comes with the look of a librarian who looks past your clothing, looks past your color, looks past any indication of your socioeconomic characteristic, and tells you to take a number and sit down. You are offering to the world, my friends in the library space, this opportunity to provide the equitable type of resources that we need to get us to the next step in our communities and countries. You are providing the visibility to the invisible. Now, I told you I was going to sound like a Baptist preacher, and I am. I relish every opportunity to get on a sandbox and give credit where credit is due, and to open up a can of worms for further discussion. It's time to reimagine the libraries in the state of Maryland. It's time to think differently about the challenges of the pandemic and what that cause of concern can do to develop our greater courageousness and to give us new ideas that show that it wasn't necessarily failure, but it was just the next pathway and step for us to be better. It's time for us to realize that we get you. We understand the challenges that every person on this call went through in some way or form, and we're here for you. And it's time for us to understand as a nation, as we roll out the largest infrastructure and investment plan, that libraries are part of the equation and need to be fully resourced. And we need to tell them and find out who's making the decisions for our communities so that we on the state level and the local level can be part of those. And most importantly, it's time to remember that technology has left the train station. It's not going back. The innovation of social media and AR and VR and artificial intelligence, pretty soon, the algorithms are going to dictate what books people should read because it goes by their preferences and their likes and their interests and their prior readings. That's left the station. And so it's up to us as professionals, as leaders, as experts, as visionaries, to figure out ways in which we take the temperature of our patrons and we take the temperature of ourselves and our institutions in which we work to meet and beat the technology before it comes. You matter. I can't say it enough. I cannot say it enough. I'm a child of an educator, I failed to say, and I'm a product of Mrs. Williams in the New Rochelle Public Library, who met me where I was at, pigtails and all, and always showed me a new discovery. It's what got me to Northwestern University to finish a PhD. It's what got me to understand the importance of education. It's what drives me to make sure my kids understand that education is a pathway out of poverty. I was a single parent for a long time. And it's also a way for me to understand as I look at the broad ecosystem that it's time for us to reimagine our library systems. Friends, as I close, let me ask you a couple questions. Are you stuck? Are you courageous? Are you revamping and recalibrating? Are you revisioning? Are you still pouting? Are you understanding that what you do is a representation and reflection of the type of equity we want to see in this world? Do you get that we know where you're coming from? We know how hard it's been. But do you know that we salute you? We honor you. We're humbled by your daily efforts each and every day. Libraries are the public good of our society. And in the state of Maryland, wherever you are located right now, from the Eastern Shores to the city of Baltimore, you matter. And we need our libraries to be supported and resourced and understood in their role to actually counter much of what we've seen in the degradation of the type of collaboration and care that we've had over our minds, of our nation's most vulnerable, our little babies, to our adults who can sit and recant the greatest lessons in history that we've ever imagined. Where are you in this conversation? And what can we do to get us here? We got the right people on this call to help in that reimagination, but I share that because I mean it. And I care about you, and I care about the future of our society as we continue to go down a path of understanding how this new media is affecting all of us. So thank you very much for having me again. I mean, I'm getting choked up. We'll stop because I don't want to mess up my makeup. But I'm really excited about your conference. I'm excited that you took the time to listen to me. And I'm hoping that we'll have a few questions that are in the queue. And let's get busy. Let's get to work. And hopefully I'll be back again in person. So thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Turner Lee, thank you so much. That was amazing. That was really, there was so much really inspirational and like call to action on so many issues. I think particularly, and I think I thank you, and you know, I think a lot of folks on this call will appreciate the acknowledgments that, you know, the pandemic and what everybody went through. It was hard for absolutely everybody, and library workers. You know, we often, you know, so many found themselves doing jobs that weren't the jobs that they, you know, they were doing, and being put in lots of strange and weird places, and opening up the sidewalk and all kinds of stuff. So I do for everybody on the call, I do appreciate those words. We do have some questions coming in, and I will, you know, try and sort through them and as we go. For the first one, why don't we start with, let's see. So are there specific policies that we should advocate for that would help push digital equity forward? Thinking of specific asks that we can make for local and state leaders.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've got this money, this BEAD money, friends. Like, this money is so big. It's bigger than the American Recovery Act under Obama. And they are looking for alternative voices. I think it's really important that we think about, I mean, we got a new governor in Maryland. I'm in Virginia, but you're so close. I could just like step into Maryland from my house in Alexandria. So it's like when I moved to DC like 20 years ago, I've always found it so interesting that I could be in 3 states in a matter of 5 minutes. It makes sense by a matter of a couple of miles. But what I would say for that is we obviously have the infrastructure money that is actually being formed right now. So every state has allocated a state broadband leader. Want everybody to find out who's the state broadband leader for Maryland, it is on the website of the National Telecommunications Information Administration, NTIA, which is at Commerce. If you just go in there and you look up the state of Maryland, you will find out who that person is. I would actually ask that you their role is to actually find you. So you may want to go and make sure they know who you are, right? And say, we're libraries and we are coming to you because as you're making decisions, we're very interested in making sure that those decisions that you make bring money to our library buildings and the surrounding communities. So I want to put that out there because they have a lot of flexibility in funding to do that. And they are going to be responsible for helping with the network infrastructure. So for all my people in rural, like Talbot County, places like that, you want to know that person because if they're building facilities, you want it near the library, right? You want to at least be able to tap into that. The second person you need to be reaching out is the Federal Communications Commission. Unfortunately, we've had stalled progress on the E-rate program, which is where you mostly get your money for technology. There was some redirection of funds through the pandemic and the emergency allocations. Obviously, that was a finite amount of money. But what the FCC is doing is that they have money for what's called the Affordable Connectivity Program. So you can actually offer that if you're not already within your libraries. It's an open national program, $9.95 internet for families who are eligible. If you don't have the pamphlets, let's go ahead and start, Maryland Libraries for Digital Equity, okay? And make sure that the FCC, who also has planning grants, finds ways to give you money to promote those programs. So what I would just say for that, there is a lot of resource out there right now, but I'm finding the challenge is it's not readily available to people. I'm more than happy to put my email and contact information in there. But if we could find a central person to find out who those resources are, it would probably be helpful that information be disseminated to everybody on this call. Okay.
Great. And so related to that, I guess from Ann McIntyre says, can you share more information about the digital equity grants specifically that you had mentioned earlier?
So there's about $2.5 billion in just the digital equity. Now it's kind of a shame, you all, $45 billion in networks, 2.5 in digital equity. It's sort of like this, right? And there's a caveat in the statute that libraries, libraries, schools, and other community anchor institutions, your anchor, will be able to benefit from that money first before the money gets allocated to churches and community-based organizations. Their process is actually being, again, states are right now, we're in the second year of the program, they're right now building what are called equity plans, literally in the process. So once they build their equity plan, so I was just actually talking to the state of Louisiana, I'll give you a perfect example. They're starting to think about the role of libraries and schools. They will probably set up their own grant program and then re-grant out to those institutions $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. The key thing is, again, get the information now of your state broadband person. Find out from your legislators how libraries are being included and the state broadband person. The equity thing, the same. And finding out the status of the state digital equity plan. And so I'll do some research, and Mike can send it over to you, but I think the state of Maryland actually has a person that's in place, a really good person by that, from what I understand. And they have started some of the state digital equity planning. The challenge with federal government is, they're going to build this big house and then tell us which part of the room we go to. That's part of the problem. So I've been, as a policymaker, advocating that they invert that. Like, people need to be at the table, much like when you're building a new home, right? So you can say, this is what I want the bathroom. I want this tile on this floor. I want this to have this. And it's not happening that way. It's very unfortunate. So part of it is we need to impress, and I will continue to do my part as a policymaker. I'm not a lobbyist, to continue to invite more libraries to the table. I've been talking about this with schools. I've been talking about it with churches. We need more people at the table, because if I could be honest, they're looking at our libraries as more so distributors of people for these programs. Yes. Oh, good. There's links in there. Oh, thank you, John. Because I'm a bad multitasker when I'm talking on internet. I'm like trying to put my email in, but those links matter, and so we can find ways during the conference, after the conference, to make sure we get information to all of you on that. Okay.
John, thanks for dropping that in there. As we were thinking on that topic too, you talked about all the new types of jobs that that may be coming, that will be coming up, and with all the new technologies and how important training is. It got me thinking. Do you think some of the infrastructures for that training already exists, or they still need to be developed? What's here now, what might come in the future for libraries?
Oh, I love it. And you know, I'm trying to multitask, so maybe I'll have a couple minutes at the end, or I'll get it over to Jody and you. If you guys have a way you'll get information to it. So we just published a paper. It's on reimagining the broadband workforce. So Mike, to your question, part of the IIJA is to ensure a responsible workforce to help with the infrastructure builds. So if we're building roads and bridges, there's supposed to be an allocation of local workers towards that. If we're putting broadband, it's expected that we'll have people doing fiber optics installation. Two things about this. It's something, if you listened to the State of the Union last night, these jobs don't necessarily require college degrees. So we can actually hire people from all over the ecosystem. They can go to community college, they can come right out of high school. Thank you, Jody. I know I meant to send those to you, Jody. That's me, because I'm thinking about the State of the Union. I was so busy trying to understand what Biden was going to say. But anyway, we do need libraries to engage in some type of online training or awareness of what these jobs are. So for example, for the broadband jobs, there's no job code at the Bureau of Department of Labor. Who thought of a fiber optic job, right? Like there's not it's for those of you that are old school, it's mostly jobs that are like mainframe computing, IT support. We don't have those jobs listed yet. I'm working on it, my policy work, to say broadband fiber installer, broadband trench worker. You all can start thinking about raising awareness about those jobs. Those jobs do two things. They pay very well, $15 to $25 an hour. They're often unionized jobs, so they have great benefits. And so the piece that Jody just put in the chat is we're trying to align manufacturing competencies with these jobs. So we're saying to people, you may not have a broadband certification because a lot of companies offer that on the job. But if you can lift 25 to 30 pounds, you know what I'm saying, Mike? Like if you're able to, you're not afraid to climb ladders, you've got good precision when it comes, I mean, these are things that your uncle does in rural America, right? He's that guy when it comes to that. He doesn't have a license, right? But he's the one that if you need like, hey, I need this shed to be rewired, he's going to do it. These are some of the people that can qualify for these jobs. Same thing in Baltimore County and Montgomery County, other places. These are folks that they're users of the internet, but they're not necessarily producing it. So I think libraries should play a role in raising awareness, promoting affordability of broadband so people at least have the tools in their home. And then 3, as we understand more about the training, because Mike, to your point, there's no training that's available that's plug and play, unfortunately. Ivy Tech Community College out of Indiana has a curriculum at the community college that they've shared online, but we're not seeing that all over the country. But the library could definitely play a role in sort of suggesting to people this type of content that can lead to available jobs now.
Interesting. Thank you. Let's see. We got, and I will say, we've still got a good bit of time left, but we're getting more questions coming in. So I'll get to as many as we can. This one's from Kinshasa, Vargas Pyle. How do we bring customers forward if we do not have the staffing and resources in our library system?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I mean, that's why I was talking about the hybrid, right? Because part of what we got to acknowledge is that we don't have the staff. So maybe we can offer hybrid, which allows people, particularly our older Americans, our disabled Americans, to engage our content and programming online. So there's been this huge thing. You all kind of know it because some of y'all sit in your offices right now to get everybody back to, again, normal, back to analog. But we are realizing, particularly like in education, that personalized connection really mattered. So there's opportunities for librarians to literally sit at their desk, without having to set up the training room that they might be doing a class to do something virtual. And I've been pressing that on a lot of different entities, even churches, to continue that, because the rush to come back in, I mean, just take the example of churches. Churches, like my church averages was averaging before the pandemic, like 5,000 people at 3 different services. Now the pastor just told us 20,000 people because of online. We're realizing that at Brookings, when we do an event in person, we have maybe 100, 200 people, normal capacity. We do it online, we have 2,000 people. So I think it's important as you think about programming, it's like we always talk about, it's so much easier for us to put a virtual program together than to do all of the safety inspections and seating arrangements. So I would say for libraries that are understaffed, you should think through a calendar that sort of says, what do we have the capacity to do this month? Are there any of these programs that could be migrated online? That's that professional development piece I was talking about. Is there something that we can do that will make it easier for a particular population that we've not reached before? Is there something that we can do for less literate learners who don't often come into the library or act like they're coming in to read something they can't read, but they would rather do this from the comfort of their home or their smartphone for that matter, right? I mean, Zoom, you can do it on your smartphone. So I think that's one way to that question of just, again, thinking creatively about your programming, about your staffing, and making the right decisions on what resource to deploy. If you all remember, we used to do this in the past because remember, we used to put on the library computers like every portal available to man. So we would put like, you go in the library when we first got computers, because I did it in community tech centers. We'd put up like 20 applications that they can click on, and then it would take them through a series of like static, transactions behind firewalls, right? Or walled gardens. Well, the internet's not like that anymore, right? You put some of that stuff up, you don't know where it's going after about 3,000 clicks. It might be going into some, we don't know what information is being collected. So what I say that is, we've got to think about our shortages and what the environment looks like today to just be much more creative in this reimagination of our libraries. I promise I'll be shorter. I told you, I'm like, I don't get you.
No, this is great. It's great. And we have another question from the Q&A. Do you have any thoughts on police presence in libraries as it relates to equity?
Oh my goodness, that is such a great question. It's such a great question. It's different, right? When you have police there. I was in Maryland just the other day at a local store over in Oxon Hill. And again, I live just a track jump from Maryland. And here in Virginia, we don't have police presence in Kingstown. You kind of walk in and out. You should, because of the society. And where I went to, for transparency, I went to the beauty supply place in Oxon Hill. There was a lot of police. And it was interesting because for the first time in my life, I was present to that. And I think I'm present to that because, like many of you, I'm hearing about all of the challenges that we're having. And I think in our libraries, which have traditionally been safe spaces, because many of you, when somebody acted up, you just kicked them out or you said, hey, listen, it sounds like, you're going through a lot, you're drunk, you're acting unruly. And it was the worst thing in the world to be a young kid kicked out of the library. I'm just going to tell you. It was like the worst thing. I think we have to reimagine how we think about security. And I do think for that question, if you start putting security or armed guards in libraries, what does that say about the guardedness of what we're trying to provide to the community? And so if there are challenges when it comes to safety, and I love this question because I've never been asked this, but I know it's real. I think it's important for librarians to also be trained in the type of lockdown procedures that we've seen schools actually do. But I do think like there are some non-obtrusive ways that we're seeing security being imposed through different type of metal, detection screening. Just don't use facial recognition and I'll love you for life until you know more about it, right? But I think that's a conversation, I'm going to stop here, that we need to have because it changes the nature of the safe space and what people think about the library. I mean, nobody thinks a security guard is there because you're going to steal books. It's a free place. I think people might think they're there to keep them safe, but then what is safety today when you're in a library and you're trying to navigate through benefit? You know what I mean? What is safety more generally? So let me think through that a little bit more and maybe get back to Mike and Liz. Oh, but that's an interesting question about whether libraries should do that.
It was. And let's see, we got about 2 more minutes. Let's see, while another question, while thinking about equity in education, what are your thoughts on Florida's recent rejection of African-American AP studies for students?
Okay, I'll give the 60-second answer. Listen, that is crazy. I'm gonna tell you why. And I'm preaching to the choir here. We have always had in our country like this debate on what is acceptable readership and what's not. I mean, we're still arguing about Huckleberry Finn, okay? Grapes of Wrath when I was in high school was controversial. Judy Blume, for that matter, was one that you didn't want young girls to read because there were conversations on whether or not it induced sexuality. You know, I think this conversation around critical race theory is interesting because it's not necessarily being defined as what critical race theory is. I mean, critical race theory is a legal framework that was developed for legal scholars to sort of think about the legal structures in which we have in this country to litigate equity. And now it's become two things that I think have been interesting in terms of politicalization of our educational system in a way that we've never seen it before. Education has normally been occupationally debated, right? Should kids be learning typing versus literature? Should they be doing this, that? Now we're seeing it sort of politicized. I think in Florida, it's a completely ridiculous proposition to not allow high school students to have a type of honors course. And it reminds me of what we went through in colleges and universities just in the last decade to constitute an African-American Studies department. And why I think it's interesting is because even here in Virginia, there is this assumption that you cannot talk about other people's cultural efficacy without reducing the significance of other, you know, it's sort of like the chemistry experiment. If I put in this much blue, this much red will be reduced. If I put in this much red, and I think at the end of the day, we have these classes, not necessarily to politicize people. We have these classes to allow people to feel a sense of belongingness. And if I can, because I'm talking to people that help me. When I was in high school, we went around the room and people were asked their origins of country. Where are you from? And so being in Westchester, many of my friends came from all over the world, right? Because we all are not really residents here in some way or form, right? Well, just the Native Americans. But people went around the room and people were like, oh, I'm part Irish, I'm part, Australian, I have some British in me. And when it got to me, they said, what do you have? And I said, I'm from Queens, New York, born and raised. And that was all I knew about my identity at the time. And I had the fortune of a librarian, actually, who raised money to send a group of us to Africa when we were in high school. And I actually realized, like, I was more than a Queens, New York, born in Queens General Hospital, living in New Rochelle. There was more to me. I wasn't this person that walked around. And then I got to read people like Langston Hughes and Bell Hooks, you see what I mean? Who actually articulated a different experience. I understood literature. And it didn't make me a person who was bigoted or prejudiced or less inclusive. It just allowed me to see who I am. And so when we see places like Florida try to reduce the ability of people who are different than what they perceive to be the majority there, of seeing who they are, I think we do a disservice, because the problem we're having now post-COVID is that we got a lot of kids who are relying on social media to define who they are. And so if I could write a book about this in my mind, because I've got another book to write, so this is not going to happen. To me, it's like goes back to the connection of what I've talked about in this talk, that you matter to us correctifying and remedying this misinformation and disinformation. And the more we actually allow these debates to come in that are not really based on truths, they're based on, political ideology or perception, we're going to create for the next generation a sense of debelongingness that's going to continue to contribute to a lot of these other outputs that we see. I mean, we can't take those books out of libraries. Those are free public institutions where, in fact, when my mama didn't want me to read Judy Blume's, I went to the library and I picked it up. I read it, because she thought I didn't have the reading level yet or the maturity. And I think it's just one of those things that we have to question as voters and policymakers, the intentions behind that. And as somebody said, and if you don't like it, you gotta move out of Florida, man. Because that's what you get in Florida. I'm considering coming to Maryland from Virginia. Some days I'm like, I could actually go over to Maryland.
Thank you for that thoughtful answer. It was really good. Thank you. We got 1 more minute, and I've got to wrap things up. But I wanted to get one more question, and I guess quickly, are there some writers and thinkers that you keep up with that you would like us to know about? Even just super quick.
Yeah, really quickly. I mean, on the art, look, we talked about the digital divide, folks. Here, let's talk about artificial intelligence next. So when I come back, let's talk about this AI stuff. There's a really good book that's out there called Automating Inequality that talks about technology and the automation of discrimination and unequal circumstances. I read a lot of wonky tech stuff, I'm gonna be honest. Algorithms of Oppression is something that's on my desk right now, in addition to my book. No one has really written about the digital divide as much as I have, so this has really been an exciting prospect for me to actually write a book on it. But my dear friend Esther Hazati just wrote something on digital isolation, which happened over COVID. But the key thing is just keep reading. Sometimes, I'm telling you the truth, I just picked up Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man and just read that cover to cover, thinking about some things in my book. So I always go back to those classics to tell you. And a really good book that I read, and I heard he's coming out with a new book. If you really want to understand this intersection that I spoke about between the digital divide and poverty, read Evicted, which is a New York Times bestseller, a sociologist who writes about the state of the housing crisis. So I read that book, and he has a new book coming out. But tons of stuff to read out there. But yeah, just keep reading. Should be our goal.
That's right.
But thank you for that too, because no one's ever you all asking me questions that nobody ever asked me.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think this was wonderful. I really appreciate your time for our group and everyone on this call. I do appreciate so much your words. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you everybody for having me. And I put quickly all my information, my email, as well as my Twitter, and I'm on LinkedIn. So just stay in touch. And I will try and get you some information on my end to share with the group.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Turner Lee. For everyone else, we are, thanks for joining us for the session. The symposium sessions will continue this afternoon at 1 p.m. with family history e-resources. It may not all be online, but a lot of important stuff is presented by Mary Mannix of the Maryland Room Manager at Sieber Arts up at Frederick County Public Libraries. And our session, the second session this afternoon, will be at 2:30. Digital Maryland, Connecting Unique Collections to Users, presented by our own Jody Hoover, the Digital Resources Manager at the Pratt Library. Dr. Turner Lee, thanks again for a wonderful talk, and thank you all for such great questions. Please enjoy the rest of the symposium. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Oh.
Thank you.
I was getting all choked up. Yes, it's so important to me. But we'll stay in touch, okay?
Yes,
thank you so much. It was great to have you. Thank you.
You.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.